Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to look at Reform, the Northern Renaissance, and the Reformation from about 1400 to 1650. And we will see how the Italian Renaissance has moved into Northern Europe and how it uses what they learned from the Renaissance in Italy and from the Italian states, city-states, and also how they have their own version of it and the types of innovations that they make, in particular in the invention of oil paint instead of fresco, and also in using optics rather than linear perspective as a way of making depth in paintings. And we will also see kind of outliers in this too, like Hieronymus Bosch, who might be the most imaginative of all the artists. So let's get into the lecture. So this is a Protestant and religious Renaissance that has humanist critics of the Roman Catholic Church, but also a mood of reform that is permeating the lives of individual Christians. We are finding a wealthy middle class, a moralizing spirit that we can find in the works of art and literature, and ominous, sometimes satirical works that urge the revival of conscience and renewed religious faith, and a heightening to the spiritual life of the community. A hallmark of the Northern Renaissance was the observation of the human being, immortalized in painted portraits, and also depicted in literature as a creature whose humanity is debased by folly, and like Shakespeare's Hamlet, burdened by moral conflict. So, in the late 15th century, the Italian passion for classic humanism had spread to the centers of the Netherlands and the Germans. And the North is absorbing the secular spirit of the Renaissance, but it'll be religious, with the twin aims of renewal and reform. Europe had attacked the wealth and worldliness of unchecked corruption in the Church of Rome, and that reckoning and moving away from the Roman Church and starting new churches is something that's going to happen here. In other words, lay brothers and the sisters of common life, as they were called, are organizing houses in which they are studying and teaching Scripture, living in the manner of Christian monks and nuns, but taking no monastic vows, and also not taking vows of celibacy. So the ideas of these apostles are following a mandate of Thomas A. Kempis, a brother of the Common Life, and the author of The Imitation of Christ in 1450. He is aiming to put the life of Christ in daily practice. Simply written devotional manual, it is a direct communication with God through the practice of humility, compassion, and self-renunciation. In other words, we don't need the priest anymore. We don't need, the Bible is about to be written in vernacular languages like German rather than Latin to make it accessible. I guess a contemporary way to say this from a Depeche Mode song is, you have your own personal Jesus, and you are able to reach out and touch faith. You are able to be your own priest. You are able to interpret, and you don't need the sacraments to get into heaven. So this movement is going to spread quickly through Northern Europe and harness those dominant strains of anti-clericism, lay piety, and also mysticism. So Christian humanism is, like their Renaissance counterparts, encouraged to learn Greek and Latin, but they're more concerned with the study and the translation of early Christian manuscripts, more so than classical manuscripts. So Christian humanists study the Bible and the writing of the Church Fathers with the same intellectual fervor of the Italian humanists that we see in their examination, say, of Plato and Cicero. So Northern scholars are giving rise to a rebirth of a focus on the revival of church life and church doctrine gleaned from early Christian literature. Let me go a little bit ahead here. So the leading Christian humanist of the 16th century, called the Prince of the Humanists, is Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. He is schooled among the brothers of common life and learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He was a superb scholar and a prolific writer, and the first humanist to make extensive use of the printing press, which was invented in 1455 in Germany. So he was a neoclassicist. He argued that everything worth knowing was set forth in Greek and Latin, and was also a devout Christian who advocated the return to the basic teachings of Jesus. He criticized the church and Christians whose faith had been jaded by slavish adherence to doctrine and ritual. And then we will study him later when we study his satire in praise of folly. Luther. So, in the territories of Germany, loosely united under the leadership of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the voices of protest were more strident than anywhere else in Europe. The sale of the indulgences, the way of getting out of penance by paying for your sins, that was used specifically to rebuild St. Peter's Cathedral, provoked harsh criticism and also probably brings up the criticism of why are we sending all the money that we give to the church to Rome when that money could be used here amongst us instead, and maybe we have more say in how it's used here. So the Germans are kind of sick of the luxuries of the papacy, the betrayal of apostolistic ideas, and in 1505, Martin Luther, the son of a rural coal miner, abandoned his legal studies to become an Augustinian monk. So he is going to go to the church. He is a doctor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, and he will speak out against the church. In his infamous sermons and essays, he offers radical remedies about what he called the misery and wretchedness of Christendom. He believes that salvation was granted through the performance of good works and not mediated through the church and the priesthood, which the Catholics believe. He believed that salvation was achieved only by faith and the validity of Christ's sacrifice. In other words, human beings were saved by the unearned gift of God's grace, not by their good works on earth. Purchasing indulgences, venerating relics, making pilgrimages, seeking intercession with saints were useless. It is justified by faith and faith alone, and Christians are assuming full responsibility for their action and intentions. Pointing out the criticism of the sale of indulgences, Luther posted on the door of the Cathedral of Wittenberg a list of 95 proposals for a theological dispute. In 1517, he takes on a confrontational tone, and he did not wish to destroy Catholicism, but rather reform it. He ultimately is finding a justification in Scripture for only two sacraments, baptism and Holy Communion, and he rejects the other five: confirmation, penitence, extreme unction at death, anointing, holy orders, and matrimony. He also is attacking the monk's way of life and also clerical celibacy. And also, he is unwilling to accept the Pope as the spiritual heir of the Apostle Peter. He's claiming that the head of the church, like any other human being, is subject to error and correction. He believes that you are consecrated all as priests as by baptism. And we're going to see later with the Calvinists that you can't be baptized before you're an adult. And the Catholics baptize children. There is a belief now that is forming that baptism must be made when you have agency to do so, when you're old enough to do so. He encourages reading of the Bible in the Old and New Testament, and ultimately he will be excommunicated by Pope Leo X. So his following year, he is charged with heresy. He refuses to recant, and he says there's no other way for me to go. Now, he is going to write the Bible in vernacular German. He is going to be a best-selling author through this. And also, he is going to help invent a form of music called the choral. So a choral is a melody in which the hymn is sung by the congregation. So think about this. Up till now, the singing in the church is done by professionals. But now Luther not only wants the congregation to be literate in the Bible, but also participate. He writes several chorals, and Our God is a Mighty Fortress is still a choral that is sung today. And I believe in some aspect, I don't remember exactly where in the American military, this is an official song somewhere in the military, and I don't remember which branch, and I don't remember exactly how it's used, but I know it is part of the American military. So you can hear the organ for accompaniment. And again, how music is going to happen in these reformative religions is going to be up for dispute, as we will find out later. So what strikes me is Luther is an educated monk. He is a subversive. He is trying to change the world through religion. He is a best-selling writer, and he's also kind of a rock star. You know, he is making chorals which often have an underpinning from popular vernacular music, and then sung in the church, not by professionals, but by the congregation. Everybody is involved now. And I think that's pretty cool. So his German Bible sells out through the new print technology of the printing press. He is enhancing education, national pride, and the exercise of individual conscience. Now, what's interesting is there are some peasant revolts in Germany, and Luther is going to condemn the violence and the brutality of the peasant revolts. And ultimately, German princes are going to come to his side because he's condemning the violence. And they're going to seize upon this to also reform themselves into Lutherans and encourage their people to be Lutherans as well. So the floodgates of dissent were wide open between German princes who were faithful to Rome and those that called themselves Lutheran. However, they are going to realize that perhaps being part of a local religion that is starting to get popular might be a way to keep the power on their side. So in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, each prince chooses religious practices in their own domain. This was Luther's writing of A Mighty Fortress is Our God, which we just heard. So in the spirit of reform, that enlightened Christians could arrive at truth by way of Scripture, this leads others to begin to interpret the Bible. John Calvin is a humanist and a lawyer. He is placing great emphasis on God's omnipotence, and he believes in a doctrine of predestination. So he believes that he should safeguard the rights and the freedom of ordinary people. He believes that state and church are separate, although they have to cooperate. And he also believes in predestination. In other words, God is all-powerful and all-knowing, and he already knows who is saved. And it doesn't matter really what you do in that regard. You're either born to go to heaven or you're not. However, you should always act as if you are saved. Now, later on down the road, I think that Calvinism in the New World is part of the justification for slavery and for taking indigenous land. Because again, if you believe that certain people are special and saved, and you believe other people are lesser or savages, I think you can still convince yourself that you're moral and going to heaven, even though you're destroying other cultures and killing other people and enslaving people. That's my contextualization for what we'll begin to see in our future chapters. Now, the other thing that's interesting in Calvinism, that ultimately, because of his radical views, he has to leave Catholic France and settles in Geneva, Switzerland. He sets up a government in which elected officials, using the Bible as supreme law, ruled the community. And then there is strict civic authority. Genevans are prohibited from dancing, drinking, swearing, gambling, and all forms of public display. So the other thing that Calvin is against, he is against music in the church. But ultimately what he finds is that by banning music completely, especially instrumentation, is that people are less likely to go to church because, hey, give people a break. Let them be entertained a little bit as they're being preached to. He ultimately will relent and allow for singing in the congregation, but for the most part is really against any musical accompaniment. Anabaptism. So in nearby Zurich, Switzerland, a radical wing of the Protestant movement emerges. The Anabaptists are opposed to the idea of rebaptizing adult Christians, and they reject all 7 sacraments, including baptism, as a source of God's grace, placing total emphasis on Christian conscience and voluntary acceptance of Jesus as Christ. The Anabaptists call for the abolition of Mass and complete separation of church from state. They hold individuals responsible for personal liberty and fundamental ideals, and they are among the first of the Western religions to offer religious sanction for political disobedience. The English offshoots of the Anabaptists are the Baptists and the Quakers, who are going to follow in the steps of the Anabaptists, rejecting the religious ritual and imagery and fundamental approach to the Scripture. In England, due to Tudor monarch Henry VIII, he is going to break with the Roman Catholic Church and establish a church under his own leadership because he's not able to get a divorce through the Catholics. So he wanted a male heir. His wife couldn't give him one, so he is going to divorce her so he can make sure that he has a male heir. He takes over all the Catholic properties. He banishes the Catholic religion and declares himself the head of the Church of England. And for years, this is going to create a hostility between Roman Catholics and the Anglicans, and also a hostility, if you remember, in the beginnings of Catholic Church, the Catholic Church in the British Isles in Ireland. In the Church of England, we are going to see great cathedrals being built, and again, a new kind of way of dissolving Catholicism as a course for an independent country. Now, the hypocrisy in some of this is kind of interesting. There are religious persecutions and witch hunts. So for 200 years following the Protestant Revolution, there are religious wars, religious persecution, Catholics persecuting Protestants, Protestants persecuting Catholics, and more or less the Catholic states that are going to stay aligned are Spain, France, and Italy. And obviously, Italy and France are going to stay Catholic because remember that at one time each one of them were the head of the Catholics with their popes. And then Spain, because of the Catholic influence that freed them from the influence of the Moors, and that their alliance will make a condition to where if they're invaded again, they will get help in terms of dispelling any Islamic invasions. So it is said that Martin Luther, threw an ink pot at the devil for disturbing his work. So this belief that the devil is a physical form, and also the belief in witches. So the Hammer of the Witches, the Malleus Maleficarum, is written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a German Catholic clergyman, and he is writing about how witches, the nature of witches, their collusion with the devil, the ways that they are recognized and punished. And since women were traditionally regarded as inherently susceptible to the devil's temptations, they became the primary victims of mass hysteria. Women, especially single, old, eccentric women, constituted 4/5 of the women executed between the 15th and early 17th centuries. So in spite of this Christian humanism and rationalization, there is also barbarism and superstition at the other end. In the Hammer of the Witches, you are taught how to identify witches, and then how to persecute and how to take care of the witch and get them out of your community. Generally including really strange things like if you tie a woman up and she sinks to the bottom and drowns, she's not a witch. If she floats, she must be a witch, and then you have to kill her. It seems to me like a way of conveniently getting rid of women who are subversive, often who are into natural medicines and herbal remedies. It seems like a way to conveniently get rid of them and still not think that they are immoral in doing so. As I said, the printing press is going to really expand this age. And the printing press invented in 1455 by Johann Gutenberg with the 42-line Bible is going to create a kind of factory of bookmaking, making paper, making ink, making the lead letters, typesetting, making sure that it's good design. And the early books are trying to copy the quality of handwritten text, but in a printed form. And you can see in the top image the type of early factory where each person has a specialized task in mass manufacturing books, also which is manufacturing more literacy amongst people. Erasmus again, in praise of folly. So Has made a satire of the Northern Renaissance, ridiculing the reasons that they need reform. He writes In Praise of Folly, or publishes it in 1516, and is attacking a wide variety of human foibles, including greed, intellectual pomposity, and pride. There are more than 24 editions that were printed in his lifetime, and also is going to influence other writers, including Thomas More. There is a kind of keen wit as applied to typical Northern Renaissance people, the theme of the vast gulf between human fallibility and human perfectibility. William Shakespeare also is going to be influenced by this, using folly, the allegorical figure who is the speaker of the piece in Praise of Folly. And he compares life to a comedy in which the players assume various roles. In the course of the drama, she observes, Folly, one may come to play the parts of both servant and king. The lecturer then describes each of a number of the roles or disciplines, such as medicine and law and so on, in terms of their affinity with folly. His most searing words are reserved for church dignitaries and theologians, and his insights expose more generally the frailties of all human beings. In an excerpt, he says, "The disciplines that approach nearest to common sense, that is to folly, are always held in the highest esteem. Theologians are starved naturalists who find cold comfort, astrologers are mocked, logicians are slighted. Within the profession of medicine, furthermore, so far as any member is eminently unlearned, impudent, or careless, he is valued the more, even in the chamber of belted earls. For medicine, especially as now practiced by many, is but a subdivision of the art of flattery, and no less truly than a rhetoric." And again, he's making fun of these professions that otherwise people would respect because of the money that they make and the education involved in that. Again, one of his admirers, Thomas More, is going to write about utopia, and he is interested in social justice for individuals. He is denouncing the acquisition of capitalism in this place called Utopia, an island that disbands itself from the mainland. He is tired of religious fanatics and allows any religion to exist in Utopia. Only atheists are to be suspected. There is a type of charity. Nobody owns property. They share things. It is a kind of wondrous new world socialist order. They use gold for chamber pots. And yet, there are other dystopic things going on here. For example, they keep slaves. They all must learn how to farm, and they also must learn a trade. They switch houses every few years, and their slaves are prisoners or other people that have been found undesirable. So again, even in More's utopia, what we find is that for every utopia, for every perfect state, whether it's socialist or whatever, that there are people that are not benefiting from it. So his idea of the ideal society differs from Plato in that each citizen, rather than society's guardians, bears full responsibility for the preservation of social justice, and law is written and practiced by everybody and made simple to understand. From Spanish Miguel de Cervantes, we get the writers who gives us the landmark novel, and really maybe the beginning of the modern novel in 1613, that has treated human failings in a satirical manner. But unlike More and Erasmus, He's writing in the vernacular, the language of everyday speech, and he recounts the adventures of a chivalrous knight who confronts reality through the lens of personal fantasy. He is this is amongst the earliest Western example of the picaresque novel, a genre of prose which is a series of episodes that narrate the comic misadventures of a roguish hero who lives by his wits in a corrupt society. The hero, 50-year-old Alonso Quixoto, escapes the hypocrisy and worldliness of his own age by immersing himself in the heroic literature of the past. He assumes the title Don Quixote of de la Mancha and sets out to defend the ideals glorified in medieval books of chivalry and romance. So he is encountering a hostile army, which is actually a flock of sheep. He is taking on a horde of giants that is actually windmills. He is living in his own world as this would-be knight, and his faithful sidekick Sancho Panza is helping this tragicomedy play out. At the end, when all of his illusions are ultimately exposed, the disillusioned hero says, "This world is nothing but schemes and plots, all working at cross purposes." Michel Montaigne is writing a philosopher. He is a philosopher of the French Renaissance. He is writing a number of short stories, but especially essays, and Of Cannibals is one of those, where he is using cultural relativism for satire and comparing the cannibalism to the barbarianism of 16th century Europe with religious wars and witch hunts and stuff like that. So he is writing the personal essay, the expository essay, prose over one idea in French vernacular, autobiographical reflection, and maybe this could be called the high watermark of the French Renaissance in terms of prose. So he poses a question, exercises original thought rather than repeating what is taught. He is skeptical and open-minded and questions the superiority of any culture over another, as again in Of Cannibals, describing the difference between a non-Christian society and a Christian society. What really are the differences? And is there any qualitative difference in terms of their ethics and morals? In England, we have a great Renaissance in England through the Tudors and Henry VIII. He is going to change the religion from Catholic to the Church of England, and they are going to raise revenue in the dissolution of the monasteries, and also watching plays becomes very popular during the Tudor period. And especially the height of it is from Elizabeth I. So Elizabeth is a little more moderate than her predecessors have been. She is relatively tolerant and avoided systematic persecution. The English defeat the great navy of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and become the great military power in the world with their navy, which is going to lead to their vast expansion into places like India and China, and ultimately into the United States. A great admirer of Elizabeth is William Shakespeare. He is a poet of unparalleled genius, emerging under the golden age of England during the rule of Elizabeth. He produces 37 plays, comedies, tragedies, romances, and histories, and 154 sonnets and other poems. He starts the Globe Theatre and also formed an acting company, Lord Chamberlain's company, known as the King's Men. So the Globe Theatre is built in London, in a place that was kind of usually for brothels and other places of ill repute. And the actors are men, and he is going to write great plays, but also in his sonnets, he is going to make the English sonnet, the quatrain, the four-line stanzas, where you have alternate rhymes with concluding couplets, and his sonnets are going to employ and mock traditional Petrarchian themes as blind devotion, value of friendship, love, enslaving power. In Sonnet 18 in 1609, he is going to be concerned about immortality achieved. He is concerned about the possibility of being immortalized through art and love. He addresses his lover as an extended metaphor. Like a summer day, his beloved will fade and die, but explains that she will remain eternal in and through the sonnet. He says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer lease hath too short a day." He ends with, "So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, gives life to thee. Immortality through love, immortality through art, even though the body does die." Now, in his stage, that is part of the confidence in Britain after the defeat in 1588 of the Spanish Armada. He is adapting classical and medieval literary traditions, and he is also making a specific theater, the Globe's Theater, with props and costumes that are essential for the male actors who are going to play all the female roles. There is a flag that is above the Globe Theater that says, "All the world is a stage." So he is creating comedies, he is into medieval morality plays, and maybe some of the best of his morality plays include Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear. He also is writing comedies like The Taming of the Shrew, and he's also writing histories like Richard II and Henry V. He is exploring the ways in which rulers behave under pressure. In Hamlet, his most quoted play, we see Hamlet is a historical piece from the history of medieval Denmark. Hamlet is a young heir to the throne and learns that his uncle has murdered his father and married his mother in order to assume the throne. The burden of avenging his father falls on Hamlet's shoulders, and Hamlet is not ready to do this. He is not the kind of guy to be an avenger. And ultimately, because of his inability to act, this will result in more or less the death of everybody. So what makes Hamlet so interesting from the other medieval and heroic poems, epic poems that we have been studying, is he lacks the sense, Hamlet, the obligation to country and community, the passionate religious loyalties, and the clearly defined spiritual values that drives all these other heroes, like Gilgamesh and Achilles and Roland. He represents a new, more modern personality, a kind of anti-hero, one whose self-questioning, disposition and brooding and skepticism resemble a modern existential character. So, in this kind of lack of obligation to his community, Hamlet is using a literary device, a soliloquy that Hamlet uses to speak to the audience and self-examine himself. In maybe one of the most famous of these, he says, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings of arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles, and by opposing and them, to die, to sleep." Later on in this, he says, "To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, where dreams may come true, where have we shuffled off this mortal coil?" So he is really trying to he's having a tough time trying to figure out how to act when it's not in his disposition to do so. Art. So art in the Northern Protestant world. So in this Protestant world, rather than the church as the main patron or big guilds, we are finding a middle class and a wealthier middle class, and also the beginnings of capitalism that we will study a little bit later. And we were finding everyday people as patrons. And Jan van Eyck is one of the early great painters, one of the early painters who's using glazing oils, thin layers of oil. His paintings are fairly small. He's using optics, which I'll show you in a minute. The pigments are bound by linseed oil, and he doesn't know about linear perspective, but is achieving his realism through optics and through painstaking detail. One of the great portraits that he paints in 1434 is the Arnolfini couple, their double portrait of a merchant who represents the Medici Bank in Bruges and his wife. The elements of the painting suggest a marriage. However, it is speculated that they were already married for many years and might have been remarried in 1434. We are witnessing them joining hands. He is raising the right hand in his rich dress. Behind him is a mirror that says Jan van Eyck was here. In Gothic letters, we see a chandelier. She is either pregnant or wearing a style of clothes that young women wear to make themselves look pregnant. We are seeing symbolism of burning candles, symbolizing the divine presence of Christ, the dog representing fidelity, ripening fruit that lies near them is about the union of the couple in the Garden of Eden, and also the carved image of St. Margaret of Antioch on the chairback near the bed, the patron saint of women in childbirth, signifies aspirations for a fruitful alliance. Now, the optical devices that I have been describing, the camera obscura, somewhat might look like this, where you have now new optical ground lens technology for glasses, for the beginnings of microscopes and telescopes that we'll be studying later. And then also for artists, the camera obscura is a phenomenon of light where in a blackened room, if you cut a little hole in the wall, the image coming in light from outside will appear inside upside down. The artist then can manipulate that upside down image and get an accurate rendition and also match the colors to create an exact realism. And this exact realism is something that we'll be studying in a lot of the Dutch art that will be coming up in our next few chapters when we're into the Baroque. Now, an artist who clearly is not using this technology is a Flemish artist named Hieronymus Bosch. We don't know a lot about him, but he made a lot of paintings. Whereas Raphael and Michelangelo are elevating the natural nobility of the individual, Bosch is detailing the fallibility of humankind, its moral struggles, and its apocalyptic endings. And we see that especially in his Garden of Earthly Delights. A triptych that, when is closed, is a grisaille in black and white of the earth, and when open is a left panel of the Garden of Eden, a right panel of the Last Judgment, and a middle panel, the garden, that shows a orgy of delights. Nude people frolicking, eating. There's an image of a guy who's getting flowers put in his butt here. That's really funny. They're riding fantastic animals. They're just having a good time, not worried about their lives or their spiritual selves. And there is a great image of that on page 232 and 233 in our textbook. Now, German artists like Matthias Grunewald, he is more expressive in his painting style. In his landmark work, the Eisenheim altarpiece, we see the crucifixion of Christ, but we see a Christ in absolute agony, full of sores, gray-green, that is showing his putrefied blood, angry thorns, fingers convulsing in agony, feet broken and bruised. And he is exaggerating the gestures of the lamenting attendants. John the Baptist is pointing an oversized finger to the Latin inscription, "He must increase and I must decrease." And with Grunewald, we are seeing kind of the beginnings of what would be known as Expressionism later on in the late 19th and 20th century. And his altarpieces are really some of the most spectacular paintings of the Northern Renaissance. Probably, though, Albrecht Dürer is maybe considered the greatest of all these artists, in terms of being a modern artist for sure. He creates the first real modern logo for an artist when he signs his work with an A and a D, and we'll be studying him more in depth. He's trained as an engraver and is one of the great engravers of all time. This is a self-portrait he did. He traveled to Italy. He learned the secrets of perspective and the Renaissance, and also is one of the great engravers with his master engravings. He is going to realize there's a lot of money of not doing original oil paintings or frescoes, but in making a matrix and then using a press to create versions of the same image, selling them cheaper and selling a lot more of them, and letting the audience know who made them through his specific logo. In the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, we are seeing from his master's engravings, 15 woodcuts in the series, we are seeing terrifying prophecies in Revelation. We are seeing billowing clouds, death in the foreground, famine carrying a pair of scales, war brandishing a sword, pestilence drawing his bow, all taking out mankind, and their victims are falling beneath the horse's hooves. And we are seeing a real grim prophecy of the coming age in which 5 million people are going to die in religious wars. A master of many media, including painting and writing, he does the great piece of turf, where we take the idea of a still life and reduce it to something minuscule. We see a small arrangement of various roots, and through his mastery of painting, we find this to be as satisfying as any expansive landscape. He's also putting out books on human proportion. So he again is interested in the mathematical ways that the human body can be represented by learning from the people that have come before him, like Vitruvius, how to do this. And he's also interested in optical drawing devices, like this mirror here that when put in front of the model, he is able to grid it off, and by using that grid, he is able to accurately find proportion in doing this. So Hans Holbein the Younger, he is one of the great German portraitists. He is born in Augsburg, but spends much of his time in Switzerland, France, and in England. And with a letter of introduction from his friend Erasmus, he travels to England and earns fame as a portraitist. In his second trip, he becomes a favorite of King Henry VIII, whose likeness he captures. Here, we are seeing an image that he created of the ambassadors. So these wealthy ambassadors are realistic. We see the wealth, we see their intelligence in their books, a globe signaling their ability to understand and navigate the world. They are obviously musicians that we see with the lute, and they have a telescope. They are clearly doing well. But this is also a memento mori, or a vanitas painting, where typically you see these paintings coming out of Spain. You're youthful, you're handsome, you're wealthy, you're smart, you're artistic, and then always the skull. And the skull is always a sign that death is always looming, and so you better have your moral and spiritual house in order. Here, in probably using that optical device, he has taken the skull, and rather than the optical device being parallel to the canvas, he is twisting it at an angle that is distorting the skull, and you can only see the skull in its normal manner when you stand to the side of the painting. The skull reveals itself in proportion in that way. Great unique painting in painting history. And then the last of the artists is Peter Bruegel the Elder. So Bruegel is making genre paintings, representations of everyday life of ordinary people. He is sometimes doing small renderings and monumental transcriptions of rural activities. We see here in his painting The Harvesters, we see people harvesting, resting during the day as they're eating lunch before they get back to work. And then we're also seeing workers way back into the landscape taking their bounty towards a granary for storage. As I had mentioned earlier when we were looking at music, that the development of music, one of the great developments, of course, are the chorals of Luther, getting the congregation to sing. And then also in Elizabethan, the English world, we are looking at, from the break of Roman Catholicism, less of an effect on religious liturgy and church music than had occurred in the Lutherans and the Calvinists. They are still writing music for the Mass, and they are composing solo songs and madrigals. For your assignment this week, I want you to write a little more in depth than you have been doing in the discussions. If you know MLA, that would be a cool way to present this. Master of Language Arts is something you should master as a college student. I won't be grading on that specifically. I am looking for a paper, though, that is rigorous and thorough, written in paragraphs, but also numbered. Make sure you number your responses. I want you to watch this about 40-minute video on Durer from the BBC about the birth of the artist. We are going to deal with talking about what fame is in the world of Durer. what makes Dewar a modern artist. Make sure you're giving examples that show me that you've watched the film. We'll talk about his prints and the prints that he's making. Why is this a good form for an artist? And then also, what secrets of the Renaissance does he learn? And then in the fifth question, now that we are at the halfway point in our class, I want you to think about, of everything that we've looked at from the Paleolithic world, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, Christianity, Islam, the Byzantines, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and now the Northern Renaissance, what's your favorite part of the class? What's your favorite subject? Or what's your favorite artwork? Or your favorite work of literature or architecture? Tell me what it is and give me an in-depth reason why. I look really forward to reading that, and I will see you soon. Goodbye, everybody.